I'd like to begin my presentation on the art, the viewer, and the spirit. Pens, pencil, paper, these are materials one would expect to find in any drawing class. Any child will tell you that a drawing is a collection of shapes and lines and maybe a shadow or two. And if you're especially ambitious, you break out the Crayola. As we get older, crayons become color theory and shadows become value. Shape becomes contour and lines, well, they remain pretty much unchanged. Only now, it's all perspective angles and fussy details. You put them together correctly and you have yourself a composition. Get them out of order and you have a doodle gone rabid. After a while, you find yourself focusing on theme above all, as it tends to be the area you've got the best opportunity to really do something new. At the beginning of my fall semester in advanced drawing class, I felt pretty much the same way, until Professor McElroy enticed her students to explore other options. After all, there's no shortage of drafting classes that work wholly on paper, no lack of artists skilled in graphite. So why not try something different? The class was challenged to come up with 20 or so experiments in new drawing materials, and I watched several of my classmates drift away from their pencils and stumbling into markers, inks, and pastels. At first, I too was tempted toward new devices that were still familiar. However, I decided to try something a bit more outside my comfort zone, and I took needle and thread and began to draw with stitch. Fiber arts were not wholly unknown to me. I gained an interest of the soft sculpture art form in 2011 when the visiting artist Caillou Easley held a show at Hammond Hall. I helped her set up her gallery show. We wound thread and blocked fabrics to create shadow play and new environmental elements. And since then, I was hooked on fiber arts, but had yet to actually find a class I could fully apply any of my ideas. With the go-ahead of Professor McElroy, I began to work with thread. My first attempt at drawing with stitch was fairly straightforward. I treated the materials like pencil and paper. Thread, like line, could be translated into form and, as a result, produce a drawing. It seemed so simple. However, life is rarely a simple thing, and materials used to create art often have a mind and a history of their own. To explain, think of a student applying oil paints to canvas. At his feet, the whole timeline of painting opens before him, from Da Vinci to Renoir to Pollock. All art produces from the eras and masters that ushered them in. This is as true for fiber arts as it is to oil paint. The difference in this case was not the adherence to great masters' work, but to the regional movement that shaped the South and indeed the entire country. History was imbued within my materials, embedding the thread, cloth, buttons before I had even finished the first stitches. A process 100 years or more in the making was beginning, and without my conscious thought, my story was being told. My materials were in control. Folk art was happening. Thread became memory, patches became places, buttons became faces. Most surprising of all, religion, raw spirituality, was welling up inside of me. Folk art has its own long era of bygone times. Back then, as sometimes today, the artwork is attributed to folksy quilts or pottery and paintings, were often associated with craft or hobby. Folk art may be viewed as the poor man's uncivilized artistic endeavors and the work of people without proper training. However, tied in with the rural locations and its people, there exists in the South a deep love for the tradition and the era it represents. Setting that aside, I hardly even expected to be creating that my work of art was going to be considered folk art, let alone experience a spiritual upheaval at its creation. However, that's what happened. And as I worked with the fibrous materials, my attitude towards them changed. I stopped treating the thread like mere lines or the buttons like adornments. I began selecting materials with reverence and empathy. A patch that before was just a random piece of cloth became my mother. The 3 buttons descending down from it were my siblings and I. My father was a knotted batch of cord connected to his children by black coarse string, while red silk thread wrapped around my mother's patch to the buttons of her 3 children. Suddenly it all mattered. The thread mattered, the buttons mattered, the patches mattered. They all meant the world to me, and yet I had no idea that it was all in folk art. It was only this simple, uncouth thing that for some raw human reason shook me to my core. It was the craft that awoke me like art. It was then that I wondered what it would take to introduce a room full of viewers to those same emotions I was feeling then, with the same sort of materials. Could I rouse a random selection of people toward a moment of inner spirituality with folk art? In order to accomplish that intangible, instinctive response from others, I began to work on my final project for the class. By chance, several weeks before, I had purchased a mannequin dummy from a clothing store that was going out of business. It had a stocky build and was covered in cloth over foam with no head on top or hands on the opposable arms. Using the same methods of careful consideration in choosing my materials that I had begun to use in regards to my folk art, I selected beads, pins, buttons, and patches, and threads that would elicit the sensations I hoped to achieve. It took me 2 weeks of concentrated work to finish the sculpture. Every spare moment I possessed that was not already devoted to class schedules or my family, I relinquished to the art. I used up every pushpin in my collection and bought 1,000 more to apply the beadwork along the statue's chest and back. Along the neck sections and shoulders, I used the pins and beads to lift up the cloth skin to represent tribal piercings and the tradition of bloodletting from the Mayans and other Central American cultures. Over the back patch, works of flowers were used to create a tree of life that was encompassed by golden pins. Bible verses and other sacred writings were stitched throughout the sides and the base of the statue as well. A long, deep maroon cloth was wrapped around the shoulder joints to give the impression of ceremonial robes. Since the mannequin bust did not come with a head or hands, I utilized those spaces for the spiritual symbols of light and emptiness. The hands were constructed using silver wire and stylized to seem both open and inviting, while also appeared see-through and almost invisible, save for the outline. At the statue's head, I melted a series of mismatched candles and allowed them to burn down over the whole of the body, like tapers in a cathedral, leaving behind their tiers of wax. My endeavor was to touch at key points of previous religious iconography without having ever used a word of spiritual rhetoric. Propaganda had no place with my statue, apart from the visual influences of folk art that it would incur on its own accord. Without any predetermined speech or roaring sermon, the statue needed to speak for itself. The object was to include all religions, or lack thereof, and exclude none. To touch on a spirituality, a feeling, a quietness within all humans, and trigger a response by way of art form. I knew too that merely creating a statue covered in symbolic utterances would do no good to those unable to translate the pattern. Ambiance was needed. Circumstance must be created. There required a place set up for the right viewing of my sculpture in order to entice the emotions of the viewer. In short, if I wanted to attain a spiritual or religious reaction, I would need a sacred setting for display. I chose a secluded room used for watercolor painting in Hammond Hall. Advanced drawing was a nighttime course, so the inky darkness of the late hour set up the temple for my sculpture. Upon the statue's first viewing, I lit the candle several minutes beforehand to let the wax build up along its form. I then took wine glasses from the art department, uses for the still life drawings, and placed tea candles inside them. I encouraged my fellow students and professor to take a goblet and follow me to the darkened room. At the door before each person entered the viewing area, I lit the candle in their cup and instructed them to place it anywhere in the room that they wished. When the last student entered, so did I. The hush of the room was thick. No one moved very much, just simply stared at the candlelight, hesitant and quiet. At first, I worried I had done something wrong. Perhaps my folk art was unidentifiable, or could not be interpreted at all. Had I made a mistake? Was I ultimately unable to engage the viewer's emotions or trigger a spiritual response that I had worked so hard to acquire? And then, like a breath held too long and then releasing, everyone expressed wonder and awe and curiosity. They did not gush in loud voices, but spoke in whispers of their feelings and welling of emotions at the statue's installation. We all discussed folk art and the legends and the beginnings of different religions, and how dramatic and enticing the dark room and silhouette of the mannequin was in the candlelight. Everyone shared their views with me, and to my pleasure, the intent of my art had come to fruition. The statue within its dark setting, with its threads and buttons, invoked the reaction of a herald, worshiping that set my viewers toward an emotionally jarring experience. My herald, my fiber art, my folk art. Thank you very much.